All right, guys. So we've been talking about early Japan so far last week. Today we're going to talk about some art and cultural developments that occurred in a city called Heian, which I am probably mispronouncing. So, really quickly, 794, the emperor decides he's going to move to this city and a group of nobles follow. Well, who are nobles? Nobles are basically people that are just rich and wealthy. At this point in history, you had pretty much just two, maybe three segments of society. You had, the emperor, royalty. You had nobles, which were basically just people with a lot of money. Usually they were royal as well. And then you had the peasantry, and that's like 85, 90% of the population living in villages, working the land, not a very fair system. So anyway, so you have this group of nobles, this group of really rich and wealthy people that follow the emperor to this city, Heian, and they establish what's called a court. A court is just a group of nobles that live close by and serve a ruler. So if we were to equate this to like the United States, it would be, all the people working in the White House, living near the White House, running the federal government. So these people have very little to do with majority of the population. Like I said, they're very wealthy, they're elitist, they don't work. And so, because of that, they have all the time in the world to dedicate to the arts. It would be like if all you had to do all day was, watch movies and listen to music and, look at paintings. All right. So, this is called the, golden age of art because of the amount of time that they spent and the developments that took place. All right, so one of the things that they invested their time in was fashion. Remember, silk was a hot commodity during this time coming from China. Women wore these long gowns that had 12 layers of silk. And as you can see in the picture, they would cut the cloth so that you could see each and every layer. What you want to keep in mind is that this was obviously not for comfort or for movability, it was for the artistic element, it was for show. Another thing is that they had these decorative fans that were, again, not necessarily to cool them down, but rather to show off the artistic element. So they had these elaborate designs. They're painted with flowers, trees, etc. The one that you see at the bottom has butterflies. And again, this isn't really about necessity. This isn't about keeping warm. This isn't about keeping cool in terms of the fan. It's really just about showing off, the artistic elements. Make sure, by the way, that you are completing your history notebook pages, that answering the questions that go along with this. Pause when you need to. All right, so literature was another area that they developed during this time. And if you remember from our discussion last week, from our notes last week, Japan rifted several things from China. One of the things they adopted was their philosophy. They adopted Confucianism. They adopted some elements of their government. They also adopted their language. Remember, most people, even though they spoke Japanese, they were writing in Chinese. So, what's interesting to keep in mind here is that men were writing in Chinese, but women were writing in Japanese. So, most of the early work that we have from Japan actually comes from female writers. And in fact, most of the accounts, how we know what was going on in the court in their life back then, is from the diaries and journals that women had written describing their life at court. Those are the primary source documents that we look at in order to determine what was going on back then. So again, this is very popular among the nobles. Most of our accounts that we have now come from women. And at this point in time, this is when another name I cannot pronounce, I'm just going to call her Lady Mira. She writes The Tale of Genji, which is considered the world's first full length novel. And that will take me to my next slide. So, what the book is about, it's about a prince and his long quest for love. That's not really significant. Maybe it is, it's not really to me. What's most significant is that, again, because only women were writing in Japanese and not even all women were writing in Japanese, this is considered the first full length novel. And what's also significant is that this was one of the first pieces of literature that really used modern elements of description in terms of like describing characters, using simile, using metaphor. And so, kind of combination of those elements make it significant in that it's the first work that we see in history that kind of mirrors what we consider to be a novel now. All right, let's move on. Another popular art form, the visual arts, and there were two in particular, two forms of visual art, painting and calligraphy. You guys know what painting is, but what's important to know is that a lot of their paintings were done in order to illustrate stories. So, for example, the Tale of Genji, people would paint a picture that was intended to tell the story of that piece of literature. They also painted scenes from nature or scenes from life at court, which is another form of primary source documents that we look at these paintings to sort of get an idea of what life was like at court during this time. Another interesting fact is that they didn't always paint on canvas, but they painted on doors and furniture. So that's kind of cool. And calligraphy is the other popular visual art form, and this is basically just decorative writing. They would write, short poems in this, fancy writing, and make it look cool. Again, remember, everything at this point in time was really just about its appearance. It was trying to just be aesthetically pleasing and whatnot. All right, performing arts. So in early Japan, we have these performances that have musicians, jugglers, acrobats. They're loud, they're exciting, they're wild and fun. Down at the bottom, that's not a historical photo. That's a picture of Cirque du Soleil because it sort of resembles what was going on back then. I'm not sure if there's any historical tie into it. But what's important to remember is that these performances start out exciting, loud, fun. There's music, jugglers, acrobats, and then around the 1300s, no drama sort of evolves from the early performances. And they're similar in that they have music, they have dance, but what's different is that they are much more serious than previous performances. So on the left, that is a picture of a no drama. And as you can see, it looks a little bit less chaotic, a little bit less exciting than what's going on in the picture to the right. Another important fact is that these dramas were intended to tell stories about great heroes or figures from the past. All right, architecture. So again, remember last week we talked about China's influence on Japan. Well, another area where they sort of adopted the Chinese model or whatnot was in terms of architecture. So they actually modeled the architecture of Haiyan, the city that they're living in, after the Chinese capital. So you could see, and so the description says that these buildings were made from wooden frames that curved slightly upward at the ends. And as you can see, it sort of looks like a nacho boat, the way that it's sort of like curved upward and whatnot. That's what it reminds me of anyway. And then these were also built in big. They had big open spaces around them. They were surrounded by ponds, by gardens, and you can see that in the picture as well. And again, important to remember is this is another thing that they adopted from the Chinese. All right, religion. So another thing that came from the Chinese, Buddhism. Remember, Buddhism is very spiritual. It promises an escape from suffering. The intent is to reach enlightenment, called nirvana. So what happens in Japan is three different types of Buddhism evolve. So the first thing is that the nobles are the wealthy, the elite. They have nothing but time. So they practice these really elaborate rituals in order to achieve that, state of enlightenment. Well, the common people, ain't nobody got time for that. They don't have time to do these elaborate rituals. So this other type of Buddhism evolves or develops, which is called Pure Land Buddhism. And again, it doesn't require any special rituals because they don't have the time for all that nonsense. And basically, all it takes is for them to chant Buddha's name over and over again in order to reach enlightenment. So that picture at the top is just a bunch of people sitting down, meditating, chanting. And then another type that develops is Zen Buddhism. And this type does not believe that faith alone will deliver wisdom, but that self discipline and meditation will deliver wisdom, which is why you can see in the picture at the bottom, there's just a little man meditating. Remember, meditating is just like quiet thinking. This type of Buddhism actually becomes quite popular in Japan, quite popular amongst warriors and samurai, which we are going to get into later in the week. So again, important is that multiple types of Buddhism, particularly to Pure Land and Zen Buddhism, but also keep in mind that the nobles were also practicing elaborate rituals and whatnot. And overall, from this screencast, 794, the Emperor of Japan moves to Heian, a group of nobles, which are just the wealthy elite members of society. They follow him. This forms a court, and because they have nothing better to do, they don't have to work, they don't have to pay bills, they have nothing but time. They basically just dedicate themselves to the arts. And what's significant about this is that a lot of the developments that they had in terms of literature, architecture, even fashion, these are still with us today.